Some people find out who they really are by accident. I found out on my hands and knees in a basement, covered in dust, holding a piece of paper that unraveled 25 years in about 30 seconds flat. But before I get to that, let me tell you about the night I sat across from the woman who raised me, in a room full of people, and watched her say the words she had probably been rehearsing for months. Because that night did not break me. That night set me free. And to understand why, you need to hear the whole story from the beginning. My name is Riley. I am 25 years old, and I live in Crestwood, one of those small American towns where the gas station attendant knows your coffee order, the pastor knows your grandmother, and everybody has a version of everybody else's story, filed away somewhere in the back of their mind. I work as a veterinary technician at a small clinic on the edge of town. It is not glamorous work. Some days I smell like antiseptic and wet dog from 7 in the morning until well past 5. But I love it, and it is mine. And for a long time that job was one of the only things in my life that actually belonged to me. I grew up in a house that looked, from the outside, like the definition of a good home. White picket fence, flower beds along the front walk that Diane replanted every spring. Not because she loved gardening, but because the neighbors could see them from the road. Diane was the kind of woman who understood the power of appearances. She was soft-spoken in public, generous with compliments, and at church on Sunday mornings, she had a smile that could make a stranger feel immediately welcome. People in Crestwood admired her. For years, so did I. She had a story she loved to tell, and she told it everywhere. At neighborhood cookouts, at school fundraisers, at every holiday table where someone new was sitting and listening. "We adopted Riley when she was just 3 days old," she would say, her voice dropping just slightly, the way people do when they want you to understand the weight of what they are carrying. It was the hardest and most selfless decision we ever made. And people would nod, and someone would always say, "What a blessing." And Diane would smile that smile, and I would sit beside her, feeling like a prop in a play I had never auditioned for. I lived in the converted garage apartment behind their house. $420 a month. 7 years of thinking that was independence. 7 years of calling it my own place, while my name was on nothing, not the lease, not the insurance, not a single document that actually mattered. Then came the Friday night at Della's Diner, my 25th birthday. The room smelled like browned butter and corn chowder, and a slow country song was moving through the ceiling speakers like it had nowhere else to be. Diane sat across from me, in a red dress she saved for special occasions, her hands folded on the table, her lipstick perfectly matched. She looked straight at me in the middle of all those people, all that warm light, all those Friday night conversations happening around us, and she said it, calm as reading from a grocery list. "We only kept you for the tax write-off." 6 words, the kind that do not land all at once. They sink in slowly, one at a time, and by the time the last one settles, you realize the floor has shifted underneath everything you thought you knew. But here is what Diane did not know sitting across from me that night. I did not cry. I did not stand up. I reached into my bag, wrapped my hand around an envelope I had been carrying for 9 months, and placed it on the table between us. Because the people sitting 2 tables behind her were not strangers, and I had been ready for this moment for a very long time. But to understand what happened at that dinner table, you need to go back 9 months, to a Saturday morning in a basement that smelled like old cardboard and pipe rust, where I found something that was never meant for my eyes. Diane had left a sticky note on my apartment door the night before. No greeting, no please, just 4 words in her neat handwriting. Basement. Saturday. Don't forget. She needed the space cleared out for Ashley, her niece, who was moving back to town after a breakup. I showed up that morning in old jeans and a pullover, dragging boxes across a cold concrete floor, sneezing through years of accumulated dust. Most of it was Christmas decorations and Roger's old fishing gear. Nothing unusual. Nothing that prepared me for what was sitting behind the water heater, wrapped in packing tape, with Diane's name written across the top in faded marker. I should not have opened it, but I did. Inside the box was a manila folder, and inside that folder, my entire life rearranged itself in the span of about 60 seconds. There was an official adoption certificate, a birth certificate I had never seen before, the original one, with the name Baby Girl Calloway typed in the center. And underneath both of those, a receipt from a tax consultant with a single line highlighted in yellow. Adoption tax credit, $5,800. I sat down on that cold concrete floor, and I did not move for 40 minutes. I did not cry. I just sat there and started recalculating every memory I had. Every time Diane reminded me how lucky I was. Every time Roger went quiet when I asked about baby photos. Every Christmas card that said our greatest blessing in Diane's handwriting, mailed to every neighbor on the block. I was recalculating all of it, one memory at a time, when my phone buzzed against the floor. I looked at the screen. It was Diane. I stared at it for 2 full rings. Then I picked up. "Are you almost done down there?" she asked, her voice light, completely ordinary. "Almost," I said. My own voice came out steadier than I expected. My hands were shaking. The birth certificate was folded between my fingers. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I said, "Almost," like it was the most normal Saturday of my life. We hung up. I sat back down on the floor. The name Calloway pressed against my ribs like something burning. That night I called my best friend Megan and asked her to meet me in the parking lot behind the clinic. She showed up still in her work clothes, read the birth certificate under the dome light of her car, and then read it again. She said the name quietly. "Calloway." Then she looked at me. "Remember that DNA kit I gave you for Christmas?" I did remember. It was sitting in my bathroom drawer, still in the plastic wrap. I had told her I didn't need it. I told her I already knew who I was. That felt like someone else talking now. "Use it," Megan said. "Tonight." So I did. Cheek swab, registration code, sealed envelope. I dropped it in the mailbox outside the post office at 11 o'clock at night and drove home in the dark. Then came 6 of the longest weeks of my life. 6 weeks of keeping my face perfectly normal. 6 weeks of Sunday dinners and passing the bread basket and saying "Thanks, Mom," when Diane refilled my glass. 6 weeks of watching her with new eyes and finally naming the things I had always noticed but never let myself look at directly. The way she said, "After everything we've done for you," whenever she wanted something. The way she told the story of adopting me like it was the greatest achievement of her life. Her voice full of pride but never warmth. And the way Roger would go completely quiet every single time she started that story, finding something very interesting to look at on his shoes. Then one evening, about 3 weeks in, Diane looked up from the kitchen table and said, "Riley, have you ever wondered about your biological parents?" I set my glass down slowly. I looked at her. "No," I said. "Never." The lie came out so smoothly it scared me a little. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her magazine. I went back to my apartment and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after that. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in my car on my lunch break, eating a granola bar and watching a sparrow hop across the parking lot asphalt. The notification slid down the screen. DNA match found. Close family. I stopped chewing. I tapped the link. The page loaded slowly, the way everything loads slowly, in a small town with bad cell signal. And then there it was. Susan Calloway. 48 years old. Harlow, a town 2.5 hours east. Match confidence 99.8%. Relationship, parent. I stared at her profile photo for a long time. A woman with curly brown hair and a tired smile, standing in front of a community health clinic in nursing scrubs. Married to David Calloway, 50. One son, Jake, 21 years old. I had a brother. The granola bar sat untouched in my lap for the rest of lunch. I tried to write an email 8 times. The first 7 were too long, too desperate, too angry, or too careful. The 8th was 3 sentences. I hit send before I could delete it. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed with one line from Susan Calloway. "I have been waiting for this message for 25 years. I read it 3 times, then I locked my phone, pressed it against my chest, leaned my head back against the seat, and sat in that parking lot until the sun dropped below the tree line. I did not know exactly what I was feeling in that moment, but I knew one thing with complete certainty. My life had just split into a before and an after. Over the next 3 months, I lived in two worlds at the same time. On my days off, I drove 2.5 hours east to Harlow, and each time I pulled into Susan's neighborhood, I had to sit in the car for a minute before going to the door, just to slow my breathing down. The first visit, Susan's hands shook so badly, she nearly dropped the casserole dish she was carrying. David met me at the front door, shook my hand firmly, and said, "Welcome home, kid," in the voice of a man who had been quietly rehearsing those 3 words for weeks, and still almost couldn't get them out. Jake, 21, lanky and loud, immediately pulled out his phone and started showing me old photos of Susan. "You have her eyes," he said, grinning. "Like, exactly." Then Susan set a small wooden box on the kitchen counter and opened it carefully. Inside, resting on a square of cotton, was a hospital identification bracelet, so small it would not have fit around 2 of my fingers. The ink had faded to almost nothing, but I could still read it. Baby girl Calloway. She had kept it for 25 years. Every April 15th, she told me, her eyes filling, I light a candle and set it on the kitchen windowsill. David knows, Jake knows, they never ask me to explain. I have never missed a single year. I visited 4 more times over those 3 months, and each time the drive felt a little shorter than the one before. On the 3rd visit, I stayed later than I planned, and my phone rang 4 times on the way home, all Diane. I finally picked up on the last call, kept my voice even, and said, "I'm on my way back, Diane." Not Mom, Diane. I hung up and sat with the silence for a moment, and then I realized I had been calling her by her name in my head for weeks without even noticing. Something had shifted, quietly and completely, and there was no shifting it back. While all of that was unfolding in Harlow, something else was being set in motion back in Crestwood. And this time, Diane was the one making the first move. I came home from work on a Wednesday evening to find a typed note sitting on my kitchen counter. No greeting, no, "Hey, can we talk?" Just a single paragraph in Diane's neat clipped font, informing me that effective the following month, my rent for the garage apartment would be increasing from $420 to $900 per month. If that was not workable, I had 30 days to vacate. Her signature at the bottom was small and final, like a period at the end of a sentence that was not open for discussion. I stood in my kitchen and read it twice. Then I walked across the yard to the main house. Roger was at the counter pouring himself a cup of coffee. I held up the paper and asked him what this was about. He did not look up. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon tapping against the side of the mug once, twice, 3 times, and then he said, "Your mother has her reasons, Riley." That was it. That was all I was going to get. I stood there for a moment, watching him stare at his mug like it held the most fascinating thing he had ever seen, and then I walked back to my apartment and sat down at my kitchen table with a notepad and did the math. $900 in rent, $380 for health insurance if Diane removed me from the family plan, which something told me was coming next. That was $1,280 a month before groceries, gas, or the student loans I was still chipping away at. On a veterinary technician's salary in a small town, that number did not work. And it was not meant to work. That was the whole point. Diane was not raising my rent. She was building a wall and making sure I could not climb over it. I opened my laptop right there at that kitchen table, the same table where she had left that note, and I started searching for apartments in Harlow. Studios starting at $650, 1-bedrooms around $800, tight but possible, especially if I transferred to a clinic out there. I sat there for a while, browsing listings in the town where my biological mother lived, in the kitchen of the home Diane controlled, and I realized something quietly and without drama. I had stopped needing her to witness any of this. I did not need her to walk in and see what I was doing. I already knew what I was doing, and that feeling, that calm and private certainty, was more powerful than any argument I could have made out loud. The next morning, I called the insurance company and asked exactly what my options would be if I were removed from my current family plan. The representative was efficient and helpful. She told me I would have a 60-day qualifying event window to enroll in a marketplace plan, and that for a single 25-year-old in a rural area, I was looking at roughly $320 to $400 per month for a high-deductible plan. I wrote the number on the back of an old receipt and folded it into my wallet. Then I called Megan. She listened to everything and then said, "Why don't you just confront them now? Tell them you know. Tell them it's over." I understood why she was asking, but I shook my head even though she couldn't see me. "Because I don't want to do this angry," I said. "I don't want to do it desperate either. I want to be ready. There's a difference." She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Okay, what do you need?" That was Megan. That had always been Megan. That same evening I called Susan and told her about the rent increase and the insurance situation. Before I even finished the sentence, she said, "You can stay with us for as long as you need. David's already talking about clearing out the guest room." I told her I appreciated that more than I could say, but I needed to pay my own way. I was not trading one dependency for another. There was a pause on her end, and then she laughed softly and said, "You know, you sound exactly like me at 22. Stubborn as all get out." I almost smiled. Almost. A few days later, I quietly reached out to Dr. Marcus, who ran a 2-person clinic on the east side of Harlow, and asked if he had room for an experienced vet tech. He called me back the same afternoon. Then, 5 days before my birthday, Diane knocked on my apartment door. She was smiling. Not her real smile, but the one she kept in reserve for parent-teacher nights and church fundraisers. The performance smile. The one that never quite reached her eyes. She tilted her head and said, "We'd love to take you to Della's for your birthday, Riley. Just the 3 of us. We have something important we want to talk about." I looked at her for a moment. I could feel the shape of what was coming, the way you can feel a drop in temperature before a storm rolls in. I said, "That sounds nice, Diane." She patted my arm and walked back across the yard. The second her screen door clicked shut, I picked up my phone and called Susan. "It's happening," I said. "Friday night. Della's Diner." There was a brief silence, and then Susan said, "We'll be there. David is already grabbing his keys." We agreed on the plan. Susan, David, and Jake would book a separate table on the far side of the restaurant, stay quiet, and wait for my signal. Nothing more. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed with my bag open in front of me, checking the envelope one more time. Susan's letter, the family photo from last month, the DNA results. I pressed my hand flat against the outside of the bag, just for a second, like I was checking for a heartbeat. Friday was 5 days away. I did not know exactly how the night would unfold. But I knew one thing without any doubt at all. I would not be sitting at that table as the grateful daughter for one more single minute. Friday came the way big nights always do, quietly, ordinarily, giving no sign of what it was carrying until you were already inside it. I arrived at Della's Diner 10 minutes early. The parking lot was nearly full, the way it always was on Friday nights in Crestwood, and when I pushed through the front door, the warmth hit me first. That familiar smell of browned butter and corn chowder and something sweet from the pie case near the register. A slow country song drifted through the ceiling speakers, soft enough to talk over, but steady enough to fill the silence between conversations. Every table was occupied or close to it. I stood near the entrance for just a moment and let my eyes move to the far corner by the window. Susan was there in a navy blue blouse, her hands folded in her lap, very still. David sat beside her, in a flannel button-down, arms resting on the table. Jake was beside him, hunched over his phone. Then Susan looked up. Our eyes met across the full length of that restaurant, and she gave me one single small nod. Barely a movement at all. That was enough. I found my table in the center of the room, sat down, and put my bag on the chair beside me, with my hand resting on top of it. Diane and Roger arrived together about 8 minutes later. Diane was wearing a red dress she reserved for Easter Sunday and the county fair, the kind of outfit that said, "This is a significant occasion," without saying why. Roger had his top button fastened, which he only did when he was uncomfortable and trying not to show it. They slid into the booth across from me, and Diane barely had time to set her purse down before she spotted Linda from the post office, sitting 2 tables away. Her entire energy shifted in an instant. She raised her hand and called out, "Linda, honey, say a little prayer for us tonight. It is Riley's birthday." Linda smiled and waved back, and I watched Diane settle into her seat, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had just made sure there was an audience. The performance had already begun, and the food had not even been ordered yet. The small talk lasted about 4 minutes. Diane asked about the clinic, did not wait for the answer, and glanced twice at her purse and once at Roger before she folded her hands on the table in a way that reminded me of Pastor Ray at the pulpit. Then she took a breath and said it. "Riley, there is something we need to tell you. You were adopted. We brought you home when you were 3 days old." I did not move. I did not blink. I had lived through this moment 9 months ago on a cold basement floor, and I had nothing left to give it in the way of shock. Diane read my silence as devastation and kept going. The truth is, the adoption tax credit was a significant part of what made it possible for us to get through those years. $5,800 annually. But you are 25 now, and that benefit has ended, and honestly, we have done our part. Roger cleared his throat and added, in the voice of a man reciting something he had memorized, "We have spoken with a lawyer. You have 30 days. Then Diane reached into her purse and set a folded document on the table beside a pen, and looked at me like she was waiting for me to pick it up. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at her. "Is that all?" I said. The words came out quieter than I expected, and Diane's smile faltered for just a half-second before she steadied it. She had been expecting tears, maybe a trembling lip, something she could manage and feel noble about afterward. She was not expecting that. She started to speak again, but I said, $5,800. Just the number. Nothing else. Her hand moved slightly on the table, an involuntary flinch, and I knew she understood that I had not learned that figure tonight. I let the silence sit for one more beat, and then I said, "I am not signing anything at a dinner table." And then, for the first time in 25 years, I did not call her Mom. I said, "Diane," just her name. It landed in the space between us, like something dropped from a height. She straightened in her seat. "Excuse me? I am still your mother." I held her gaze. "You just told me you're not." Roger made a low sound and pressed both hands flat against the table, like he was trying to keep himself from rising out of his chair. Diane leaned forward, and something in her eyes shifted, the careful softness she had worn all evening beginning to peel back at the edges. Her voice dropped but did not quiet. "Nobody wanted you, Riley. Your real mother was just some girl from Harlow who could not keep her own child." The table beside us went completely still. I heard a fork stop against a plate. Linda's hand came up to cover her mouth. Pastor Ray, who had been sitting 2 tables over with his wife, turned fully around in his chair. I raised one hand, palm out, and said one word, "Stop." Diane actually stopped. "You do not get to talk about her," I said. "Not tonight. Not ever." Then I reached into my bag and placed 3 things on the table, one at a time. First, a single dollar bill, to cover tonight. Second, a printed DNA report, folded once, which I opened and laid flat, 99.8% match. Third, a photograph taken the previous month, me standing between Susan and David in their backyard, all 3 of us squinting in the afternoon sun, all 3 of us smiling in the way that cannot be staged or practiced. I set the photo face up in the center of the table and said, "Funny you should bring up my biological mother, because I found her 9 months ago." Diane stared at the photograph. I watched something move across her face that was not quite any one emotion, more like the moment a screen freezes before it crashes. "And they are here," I said. "Right now, in this restaurant." Her head came up and her eyes swept the room. In the far corner, Susan was already standing. David rose beside her, and Jake pushed back his chair and followed. They walked across the full length of Della's diner at an even, unhurried pace, and every conversation in that room thinned and then stopped. The country song kept playing through the ceiling speakers, but nobody was listening to it anymore. Susan reached our table and stood beside me and placed one hand on my shoulder, warm, steady, deliberate, and said, "I am here because my daughter asked me to be." Diane shot to her feet so fast her chair scraped the floor, and the water glasses trembled. "Your daughter?" "I raised her for 25 years. Susan did not raise her voice. She simply said, And you just told her she was a tax benefit in front of 40 people. Roger stood up quietly on the other side of the table and reached for his jacket. Diane turned to him immediately. Roger, say something. Roger looked at me. Then he looked at David, who was standing behind Susan with his arms at his sides and his feet planted, having driven 2.5 hours on a weeknight to stand behind a daughter he had known for less than a year. Roger looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at me. He did not say a word. He put on his jacket and walked to the door. Diane watched him go, and for just a second her composure cracked completely. Not into sadness, but into the raw, exposed expression of a woman whose script has just been taken away. She turned to Pastor Ray, her voice unsteady for the first time all evening. Ray, you know me. You know what kind of person I am. Pastor Ray looked at her for a moment, with an expression that held no cruelty and no comfort. Diane, he said quietly, I think this is a conversation you need to have with God, and with your daughter. Diane picked up her purse. She did not take the unsigned document. She did not take the pen. She walked to the door without looking at me, and the sound of her heels on the hardwood floor was the only sound in Della's diner until the front door swung shut behind her. Then the room exhaled. The music came back into focus. Susan sat down in the chair Diane had just left, and David pulled over a chair from the nearest empty table, and Jake dragged one from the other side and wedged himself in at the end. Susan was crying. Not the quiet, composed kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes from 25 years of not knowing, and not holding, and not being there, all arriving at once. I took her letter from the envelope, unfolded the hospital stationery, and read one passage out loud. The part about the night I was born, about the labor nurse named Carol who held her hand through 3 hours, about the hospital bracelet she had slipped off my wrist and kept in a box before they carried me away. Every April 15th, I read. I light a candle and set it on the kitchen windowsill. David knows. Jake knows. They never ask me to explain. I have never missed a single year. I folded the letter and set it down. The table was very quiet. Then Linda from the post office stood up, walked across the room with a napkin twisted in both hands, and stopped beside my chair. I am so sorry, honey, she said. I had no idea. She went back to her seat and immediately took out her phone. By morning, every person in Crestwood would know. Then Jake looked up from across the table and said, So, can we order? I drove 2.5 hours and I am genuinely starving. The laugh that came out of me was sudden and real, and completely unplanned. And Susan laughed too, through her tears. And even David grinned. And just like that, the air in the room changed into something that felt almost like ordinary. Della herself appeared with extra place settings, balanced on one arm, and said, Tonight is on the house. All of it, and walked away before anyone could argue. Then Susan reached into her bag and brought out a small velvet box. Inside was a tiny hospital identification bracelet, the same one from her kitchen box, now threaded onto a thin silver chain. She held it out to me without saying anything. I took it and fastened it around my wrist, right there at the table. The plastic was brittle and almost weightless, but it was the heaviest thing I had ever worn. For the first time in 25 years, I was sitting at a table in my own hometown, and I was not performing a single thing. Here is part 5 in American English, written for audio.tts delivery. The next morning I packed my entire life into 4 cardboard boxes, and I want you to sit with that for a second. 4 boxes, 7 years, done before 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Megan showed up at 8 without me having to ask. She did not say a word about the night before. She just walked in, picked up a box, and started carrying. That is the kind of friend she is. While she loaded the car, I called the insurance company, gave them my new address in Harlow, opened a marketplace plan in my own name, and wrote the confirmation number on the back of a gas station receipt, because it was the only paper I could find. Then I set the apartment key on the kitchen counter, placed the signed move-out document beside it, and wrote one line underneath my signature by hand. You don't need 30 days. I'm done today. No letter, no speech, no final confrontation. I walked out, got in my car, and pulled out of that driveway for the last time. I did not look in the rearview mirror for the first 3 miles. Then I did. The house was small and getting smaller, and then it disappeared around a curve in the road and was gone. I did not cry leaving Crestwood. I cried 15 minutes later, when the GPS said, in its calm and completely indifferent voice, "You are now entering Harlow." It sounded like the first true thing anyone had said to me in years. In the weeks that followed, I visited a legal aid office in Harlow and met with an attorney named Carol, who had a firm handshake and a desk covered in family photos. I told her everything. She listened without writing a single note, which I had already learned meant she was hearing something familiar. Then she told me plainly that there is no legal mechanism in this state, or any state, for parents to formally disown an adult child. Roger had either been misled or he had lied, and either way the threat had never been real. She also helped me request the full adoption file from the county clerk, and 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the Calloway house with documents I had never seen. The detail that stopped me cold was this. Susan had not voluntarily signed the relinquishment papers. Her own parents had signed on her behalf. She was 22 years old, and no attorney had represented her, and no one had explained what she was agreeing to. I read that page twice at the kitchen table, while Susan was in the next room, and I made a quiet decision to wait for the right moment to share it with her. Some truths need the right container. That evening, I sent Roger one text message. The attorney confirmed, "There is no such thing as legally disowning an adult child. You already knew that. I hope someday you understand why you went along with it." He read it at 9:47 that night. He never replied, but every Tuesday morning since then, without fail, a 2-word text arrives from his number. "Hope you're well." And I write back 2 words. "I am." That is enough. For now, that is enough. Back in Crestwood, Linda's text messages from Friday night had done their work. By Monday morning, the story had traveled from Linda to her sister, to the book club, to the PTA, and by Sunday, the pews around Diane's usual spot at church were noticeably emptier than normal. Not dramatically, just enough, the way a small town quietly communicates what it knows, without saying it out loud. Pastor Ray's sermon that week was about stewardship, and at one point he said, "There is a difference between raising a child and owning one." Diane was not there to hear it. She had already posted a single vague line on social media about making hard decisions for the people you love, which collected 47 comments, none of them the kind she was hoping for, and she deleted the post within 2 hours. Ashley, her niece, moved out of the garage apartment after 5 weeks and sent me a message that simply said, "I didn't ask for any of this. I'm really sorry." I wrote back, "I know, none of it was your fault." Because it wasn't. The apartment sat empty after that. Diane had dismantled everything to make room for someone who didn't want to stay. My new life came together the way good things usually do. Not all at once, but steadily, one ordinary day at a time. Dr. Marcus's clinic smelled like wet golden retriever by 9 every morning, and I loved it immediately. Jake and I settled into the rhythm of siblings without either of us planning it. Horror movies versus action movies on Saturday nights, arguments about pizza toppings conducted with the kind of intensity that only makes sense between people who are still figuring out that they actually belong to each other. One Sunday afternoon, Susan was teaching me her pot roast recipe, and she stopped mid-stir and looked at my hands and said, "You fold your sleeves exactly the way I do." She was right. Same fold, same crease, same tuck at the elbow. 25 years apart, and our hands had learned the same small habit from somewhere neither of us could explain. David taught me how to change a tire on a cold October morning in the driveway, something I should have learned at 16 from a man who was too busy not making waves to teach me. And in the evening, sometimes David and I would sit on the back porch without talking, each of us with a cup of coffee, looking out at the tree line where the yard ran into the dark, and I came to understand that silence like that, comfortable and undemanding, was what a real family actually sounded like. Then came April 15th. My 26th birthday. Susan made lasagna from scratch. David grilled out on the back porch even though it was barely 60 degrees. Jake drove to the bakery in town and came back with a cake that said, "Happy birthday, sis," in blue frosting that was already sliding slightly to the left, which he seemed genuinely proud of. Megan drove in from Crestwood with a bottle of wine and a card that read, to the only coworker I would commit a felony for, which made Susan laugh before she even finished reading it. We sat around the Callaway kitchen table, all 5 of us, loud and overlapping, and completely unscripted. And when Susan carried the cake out with 26 candles burning, she stopped in the doorway for just a moment and said, "This is the first time I have ever gotten to do this in person." And her voice broke on the last word, in a way that made the whole room go soft and quiet. I closed my eyes over those candles. I did not make a wish. I did not need to. Everything I wanted was already sitting at that table. I blew them out. Jake clapped. David squeezed my shoulder. Megan raised her glass. Susan cried. Jake looked at the ceiling and said, "And here we go," which made everyone laugh, and that laughter was the most honest sound I had heard in as long as I could remember. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in my apartment, $650 a month, 2nd floor, window facing the trees, every bill in my own name, not a tax benefit, not an arrangement, just mine. And I lit a single white candle and set it on the windowsill. For 25 years, Susan had lit a candle on this date and set it in her kitchen window, and David knew, and Jake knew, and no one ever asked her to explain. Now it was my turn. But this candle was not for grief. It was not for the years I lost, or the truth I found too late, or the woman who looked at me across a dinner table and told me I was a line item. This candle was for the beginning of something. I looked at the hospital bracelet on my wrist, almost weightless. The ink faded to a whisper. I looked at the photo on the bookshelf. All 5 of us crammed onto the back porch. Nobody looking at the camera. Everyone laughing at something Jake had just said. I spent 25 years being somebody's tax write-off. Now I am simply somebody's daughter. And that, more than anything else I have ever been given, is more than enough. The flame flickered once. Then it held steady. So did I.